Right, okay, so good morning everybody and welcome to today's webinar. We're very pleased to welcome back Graham O'Mahony from Asbestos Training Limited, who is back to deliver another webinar today. Graham recently delivered a webinar on asbestos management in buildings and is back today for part 2, in which he'll be focusing this time on asbestos management on site. If you haven't seen part 1 of this, don't worry, as you can watch this back via our YouTube channel, details of which I will send out to you all after today's webinar. So before I hand you over to Graham, I just want to mention a few things. Firstly, for those of you who haven't attended one of our IOSH webinars, I'm Ben Pollard and I take care of the technical aspects of these sessions. So any problems, and I should try to assist as best as I can. So on your screen then, at the top left-hand side, you'll notice a small bar with some written options, which are chat and Q&A. If you have any technical issues or audio problems and you need to message me at any point, please use the chat option. If you have any specific questions for Graham relating to the content of the session, please use the Q&A option and ask your questions here. I'll run through the questions with Graham after his presentation has finished, and we'll aim to tackle as many of these as possible. If for any reason we do run out of time and there are still questions remaining, we'll look at these at a later date and aim to post some written answers online along with a copy of the recording of this webinar. So, with all that said, I'll now hand you over to Graham and I hope that you all enjoy the session.
Thank you, Ben. Good morning, everybody. As kindly introduced by Ben, my name is Graham O'Mahony. For those of you who don't know who I am the current chair of UKATA. A very brief introduction about myself. I started my career as a plumbing and heating engineer working for British Rail when we had a British Rail. I then moved on to work as a building surveyor for a local authority, obtaining my degree in building surveying, and this was towards the back end of the late 1990s. I moved into the asbestos surveying department, dealing with the local authority buildings, commercial buildings, etc. One of my roles there was responsible for managing asbestos, but at the same time of managing asbestos in the buildings, I was also responsible for managing the contractors and any remediation works that needed to be undertaken by the local authority. So I have worked quite closely with the asbestos removal sector for many years. I then moved away from local authority, started working in the private sector, and I now run a few companies, one being an asbestos training providing company, delivering various different training courses. So in essence, what you're going to get today from myself is a 3-hour training course condensed down to around about 45 minutes. My other role is, as mentioned, is the chair of the UKATA, as the chair of the association, which does obviously take up some of my time dealing with the strategic side of the association. As Ben kindly mentioned, this is part 2 of a 2-part series. The first part you can see obviously on the screen has been cleared out. That was quite an interesting session. We got lots of feedback on that. Now, my reason for doing the 2 parts is that I believe there's 2 parts of asbestos management. The first part is managing the asbestos in buildings. The second part is obviously once we've determined obviously the asbestos that may need to be removed or repaired or any remediation works, we've then got to appoint the relevant contractors to do such work and undertake this work. And certainly in relation to other regulations, the client or the principal contractor will have responsibilities to manage the asbestos removal contractor, whether it be a high-risk work activity such as a licensing activity or a low-risk work activity such as maybe maintenance works, etc. So we're going to be looking at how it's removed, the selection of the contractor, which is very, very important. If we get the right contractor, then of course that will help the project out. Quick look at site inspections, and then certain documentation that you need to be looking for, and obviously asking from the contractor. Now, before we consider different types of work with asbestos, we need to define what we mean by working with asbestos. Now, work that was defined as in the regulations, the Control of Asbestos Regulations L143, work with asbestos includes work which removes, repairs or disturbs asbestos. So a good example of that would be a contractor is going to remove some asbestos roof sheets, or maybe drill holes in textured coatings or remove some floor tiles. That is all defined as working with asbestos. There is also a definition of ancillary works. Now that would be example of that would be scaffolders. So the scaffolder is working with, say, a licensed contractor, erecting a scaffold to assist in the asbestos removal work. So they would, in some cases, need to have a license to do that type of work. And then the final one on the screen is a supervision. So an organisation supervising works, they also have to have what's called a supervisory license in most cases, and of course supervisory work of asbestos is also classed as working with. Now there are two distinct work types under the regulations. The first one, I'm sure most of you are very common with, is the licensable works. We'll come to define what licensable works is in a second or two. Generally high risk work activities, and you'd need to use specialist licensed contractors for that type of work. And the other type of work is what we refer to as the non-licensed works, or NLW, and that does also now include, since 2012, the notifiable non-licensed works. But we'll look at that shortly. I've got a nice little pictorial there which we can hopefully help define that in an easy format. So licensable works, when does works with asbestos become licensable, in the sense that you would need to use a HSE licensed asbestos contractor? That is defined as where the exposure to the individual or the work is not sporadic and low intensity. Now, what that refers to as is to low risk or sort of low levels of exposure over a period of time. Now, the current figure for that is 0.6 fibres per centimetre cubed over a 10-minute period. Now, obviously, most work activities are going to lead to longer than 10 minutes on site. So, although it is in there, the main aspect we refer to is what's called a control limit. Now, a control limit is a static figure laid down in legislation, and that control limit triggers certain aspects of the regulations. The control limit, as you can see on the screen, is 0.1 fibres per centimetre cubed, but that is over a 4-hour period. And the reason we have the sporadic and low intensity exposure is because we could, in theory, do what's called a time-weighted average of the control limit and maybe reduce the amount of time, but of course the exposure could then potentially increase and get to a point where it could be too high. So if the worker exposure is not sporadic low intensity exposure, and of course the control limit is not exceeded, and it goes on to say that on coatings such as sprayed coatings, on steelwork, etc., and then it goes on to say on insulation or AIB insulation board where the risk assessment demonstrates the work is not sporadic low intensity exposure and the control limit will not be exceeded, and it's not short duration work. So there's a time aspect with regards to that. Now, obviously we can read the regulations, we can read the specifics on that, but I'll show you a table now, which obviously is taken from L143, which gives some examples of which types of works fall into which categories. So on the left, sprayed coatings, lagging work, loose fill insulation, cleaning up significant quantities of loose fibre debris, and work on AIB where it's not short duration. I'll explain the time on that in a second or two. On the left-hand side, they would generally require a licence issued from the HSE for the contractor to do that work. On the other side, we can see, which doesn't normally require a licence, small short duration maintenance works, removing textured coatings, cleaning up small quantities of loose fine debris. But again, all of this must obviously be below the control limit as set down under the regulations. Work on asbestos cement and other products, things like floor tiles, products which are firmly linked within a matrix. Now, the specifics under Regulation 3.2, which gives the exemptions of not requiring a licence, they are sometimes very difficult to interpret and sometimes very difficult to read. And for most of our sort of clients where we deal with the plumbers, the carpenters, the electricians, and some of the clients who are engaged in non-licensable works, we've developed a sort of simple table which sometimes helps us out with this. So if we look at the screen, we can see on the left in the red danger, and on the green, obviously, is the non-licensable work. So if we start on the left, generally speaking, what we're referring to is the spray coatings, because the level of exposure is likely to exceed the control limit. And of course, there's no exemption there for spray coating to be non-licensable. Insulation and AIB, insulation board, again, they're likely to exceed the control limit in most cases. And what we generally advise is that for any of those types of work activities, we would strongly advise that a licensed contractor is used. Now, of course, at the bottom of the screen, you can see where the control limit comes in. So The reason those are in that section is that because the control limit is more likely to be exceeded, and we have to make some assumptions and err on the side of caution, they would obviously become licensable. For licensed contractors, one of the things they will have to do is they will have to notify the works to the HSE. They use an online form, which is called an ASB 5. If you are engaging licensed contractors, you would need a copy of this to inform you that the work has been notified. They have to give a statutory 14-day notification. The 14 days is 14 days, not working days. So it does include weekends, and that is a whole 14 days. So, for example, if they notified at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they would then have to make sure that they wouldn't start work until the 5 o'clock on the 14th day. So it is a whole 14 days. They also have to have a medical. The medical is a 2-year medical by an EMAS doctor. That's the Employment Medical Advisory Service doctor. And of course, they have to have a certification for that, no certificate. And of course, they can't then undertake any licensable works. In addition to that, the employer will have to keep records of their exposure for 40 years or up to the age of 80, whichever is the longer period. So you can see licensed contractors, there's quite a lot that licensed contractors actually have to undertake to be able to do that type of work, in addition to the formal interview process and record keeping, competency assessments, etc. Now, there is an exemption for short duration works, and the short duration works are defined for installation and AIB, but I'm going to put it out there. My advice is that I don't think there should be any short duration works on installation, and we don't exercise that, and we try to steer people away from that. But there are some short duration works for AIB. They're defined as if the work can be done within 1 hour in 7 working days, or a maximum of 2 person hours in 7 working days, then that work obviously would not require a license. That would be non-licensable work. So an example of that would be a plumber needs to drill a hole through an AIB panel to pass a pipe through. Then that plumber, as long as they're suitably trained and competent, they could actually do that work as long as that work did not exceed 1 hour in 7 consecutive days. Now, if it took them 1 hour, that also has to include the time setting up. So if they put their polythene sheet down, get their vacuum cleaner ready, put their PPE, their RPE on, put their control measures in place, and drill the hole and then clean up, that time has to take into account all of that work activity. So they're not going to get a lot of work done on AIB. The 2 person hours works is that no one person can do more than 1 hour, and the maximum time on that job could not exceed 2 person hours. So you could have one person doing 1 hour, another person doing another hour, short non-continuous maintenance works. The key word there is maintenance. And it is in place there really to assist the likes of the plumber, the electrician who does need to maybe access a panel to carry out a maintenance work activity. But we'll just define maintenance works activities shortly. So there is some scope there for short duration works. A question I often get asked is, can licensed contractors do short duration AIB works? And the answer is yes, they can. Often they don't like to, for the simple reason that because it's AIB, in their mindset, it has to be notified, but it's very clearly laid down. It becomes a non-licensed work activity. But remember, they would still have to be suitably competent, suitably trained. They'd have to have all the control measures. And one thing, if we refer to the bottom left of that screen, they must not exceed that control limit whilst they're doing that short duration works, because the control limit really is the rider, which will trigger the licensed contractor. So what falls under the green column then, under non-licensable work? So common products, which I'm sure we're all aware of: asbestos cement, so this would be flue pipes, roof sheets, gutters, downpipes, etc., cold water storage tanks, textured coating, excuse me, commonly known as Artex. Just bear one thing in mind with Artex is that large-scale Artex works does become notifiable non-licensed works, and of course, as such, they will require sort of enclosures and airlocks and negative pressure units. So, although it is sitting in the non-licensed works, it is non-licensable works. Most of that works is still done by licensed contractors because they have the tools and the competency to be able to understand the control measures. Other products: gaskets, WC systems, floor tiles, bitumens, resin-based products, and textiles such as rope seals. On the proviso that the control limit won't be exceeded, which in most cases on those products with the right control measures, the right assessment, the control limit won't be exceeded, the works would then be classed as non-licensable works. Now, up until 2012, we have had a 2-tier system in this industry, the 2-tier system being licensable versus non-licensable. However, due to an amendment of the 2012 regulations brought on by the EU directive of 2005, there is a third tier. So we now have licensable, non-licensable and notifiable non-licensed works. So if the work is non-licensable, then of course there is no notification. The HSE will not be informed of that. There is no medical requirement, there's no record keeping requirement, and of course the HSE won't be involved in that type of work. So it's sort of self-enforced by the contractor undertaking the works, and clients need to ensure that of course the contractors are doing that work correctly. The third tier, which was brought in 2012, is the notifiable non-licensed work. So if the product is degraded, or it will be degraded during the work activity, such as, for example, a corrugated roof sheet which is being removed, and it's being removed whole, there's no breakage to the asbestos, and it's being wrapped, that wouldn't be classed as degraded. The odd small breakage wouldn't be classed as degraded. However, if the asbestos cement was subject to fire or flood and the matrix of the product has been lost, then of course the product is then classed as degraded. Therefore, that would fall under the purple column. A good example that would be textured coating. Drilling holes in textured coating is classed as maintenance works, but if we started to use a water-based solution such as X-Tex, texture removal, or steam to break the matrix down, then we would be degrading the product. Therefore, that work would fall under the purple column. There is some future guidance planned by the HSE to further define this, but there are some good clear definitions in L143. Now, if the works is classed as notifiable, then of course, there is a notification. The notification form again is electronically. That is an ASB NNLW1 form, and that would be submitted prior to the work starting. There is no time in this, so there's no 14 days. That should be submitted before the work starts. So in theory, if it's an electronic form, it can be notified and then the works can commence straight away. Same aspects on record keeping as for licensed contractors, 40-year plus. However, there is a slight difference with the medical. It's a 3-year medical, and that's undertaken by a GP. Now, the 3-year medical, for the first 3 years of the regulations coming in, there was a 3-year grace period for that medical. That grace period expired on the 1st of May 2015. So in theory, anybody now doing degraded or notifiable non-licensed works will have to ensure that that medical is in place before they do notifiable non-licensed works. But reverting back, if the works can be done maintaining the integrity of the product, removing the product as whole as possible, the odd breakage, slight breakage is not going to be a problem, that work would then be classed as non-licensed works. No notification, no medical, and no record keeping. Products which are classed as firmly linked within a matrix, so again, common products which we've just really mentioned: asbestos cement, textured coatings, bitumen products such as roof and felts and adhesives, thermoplastic and vinyl floor tiles, flooring, linoleum flooring, and then of course the old common toilet cisterns, hard black resin-based cisterns, which again lock in the fibres in place. With the introduction of the CAR 2012, there was 2 further definitions that have been given to determine if the works is notifiable non-licensed works, and these are defined as: is it classed as maintenance works or is it classed as removal? Now, of course, if it's removal and the product or the material is being removed where the matrix is held in place whole, then of course that would be classed as non-licensed works. But of course, if the removal is going to degrade the product, then it would be classed as notifiable non-licensed works. But the maintenance one is the key one. For example, if we had an example of where a panel had to be removed, let's say, for example, an asbestos insulation board panel, and it was going to take less than 1 hour to access a valve to repair a leak behind a box in, for example, the works would be classed as non-licensed because it could be done under short duration maintenance works. And of course, the panel would then have to be removed. It's advisable that it would then have to be disposed of. Now, the concern here is a lot of clients get this question about: is it maintenance or is it removal? Because they are actually removing the asbestos. So maintenance has been further defined, and the statement there is defined as drilling holes or painting. It also includes the removal of ACMs where the removal is ancillary to the main task. So, for example, the plumber has to remove the panel to repair a leak. The actual removal would only undertake because the plumber has to repair that leak. Therefore, the works of the removal is ancillary. it's not classed as removal, it would be then classed as maintenance works. However, if the plumber was just to turn up to remove the panel but not do any other works, possibly as part of refurbishment or demolition, then that would be classed as removal works. So in some aspects, the maintenance contractors undertaking non-licensed works, they do have a little bit of a leeway in the definition there, because whenever they do tend to remove asbestos, it's normally done for a reason to carry out maintenance work activities such as drilling holes or removal of that AIB panel. Remembering one thing, the training of employees, there are 3 types of training courses stated in the regulations. The first one is the asbestos awareness. So asbestos awareness, just remind everybody, that does not enable anybody to work with asbestos. That is purely, as it is stated, an awareness. Excuse me. The other is training for non-licensed works. So that would be often referred to as category B. That's about a day and a half duration. And then of course the C would be the training for licensable work. So if we remove the A from that list, the 2 types of training courses available for people undertaking work with asbestos is B and C, undertaken by training providers, UKATA training providers, etc. Now, for those undertaking non-licensed works, there is a guidance document. There's a picture there on the screen of the guidance document. It's called HSG 210. Which is the Asbestos Essentials Task Manual. It's broken down into 2 sections. The first section is the EMs, and they look at the equipment and method guidance. So that would look at RPE, PPE. That would look at quite a lot of the generics, vacuum cleaners, wetting, decontamination, waste, etc. And then there are 38 different tasks, obviously within those sheets, which look at a task of, say, for drilling holes, removal of floor tiles, removal of roof sheets. Common one is A23 floor tiles, A14 is roof sheets. And of course they are sort of broken down into what the works will entail, how the work should be undertaken, all the control measures that are required, and of course what they need to do with regard to the waste and other aspects. For licensed contractors or licensable works, we have our own guidance document for that. That one is a document called HSG 247. That is somewhat old now. It predates the 2006 regulations, and if you do read it, just be very mindful that the beginning of it does refer to the CAWR 2002. It quotes things like action levels. There's different control limits in there, so it's currently being reviewed by the HSE, and we're hoping that that will be reviewed and updated very, very soon. Now, so we've mentioned licensed and non-licensed, but we need to break the license side down a little bit further. It's not as simple as that there is only one license issued by the Health and Safety Executive. There are actually 4 practices that require a license issued by the HSE. So of course the common one that we tend to refer to is the removal, where obviously the exemptions under Reg 3.2 cannot be satisfied, i.e. short duration works, sporadic and low intensity exposure, and of course the control limit won't be exceeded. There is also, to remind you, of scaffolders. So scaffolders who are erecting scaffold to enable licensed asbestos removal works to be undertaken where, and this is important that you understand this, where it's foreseeable that the asbestos will be disturbed, then they would also have to be licensed by the Health and Safety Executive. So a good example of this would, where a scaffold is erecting a platform to remove some asbestos lagging, there's a potential that they could damage the lagging, the scaffolder would then need to be licensed, and they would have to go through the same sort of notification, medical record keeping, etc. However, if the scaffold by assessment is not likely to disturb it, but they are still putting that scaffold up for licensed contractors, then the scaffolder wouldn't need to be licensed, and a normal scaffolder could be used. So it's where it's foreseeable. So it's all about the risk and the assessment of that risk. We also have a license for supervisory license holders. So this would be consultants, analysts, etc., who, where clients have big projects where they don't feel confident to manage, they can engage an external consultant. Obviously, they're going to charge a fee for that, and that's consultancy would have to again follow the notification, and they would also have to have a supervisory license, or an SLH as we often refer to it. Currently, I believe, I hope I'm right in this, but there are no SLHs in the UK currently present. Most clients will be competent to be able to manage their contractors doing the work. And then, of course, companies maintaining negative pressure units and vacuum cleaners, because obviously they've got HEPA filters in those, and of course they would need to be removed and changed. So of course they have to also maintain a license. The main one obviously being asbestos removal. As part of the license requirements, there is a notification. I mentioned that earlier on the ASB 5. That notification obviously has to be submitted within before 14 days of the works commencing. It could be submitted longer than that, that's fine, but it certainly has to be within the 14 days. This gives the enforcement authority the opportunity to assess the proposals, and they may request additional information, but the ASB 5 is the only form that is submitted to the HSE. Now, on occasions, we can't wait 14 days. It may be that there's been some weather and it's damaged some asbestos, which is completely out of our control. There may be some malicious damage to areas where there is a potential health and safety risk to other people. So in some cases, a waiver could be requested. This is a shorter period, also a dispensation of the 14 days. And of course, the idea and principle behind that is that where there is a serious risk to health and safety, and of course it wasn't foreseeable, then of course the contractor can request a waiver. If the waiver is requested, in most cases, the client will also have to engage with the HSE to demonstrate why that waiver should be granted. And they do grant waivers. There are occasions where sites can't wait 14 days. So there was always that option, but just bearing one thing in mind, if it was foreseeable that the works could have been prevented damaging or disturbing the asbestos, then in most cases the waiver won't be granted. Very, very quickly, I'm going to flick through these very, very quickly. This is just an online screenshot of the notification form, the ASB 5. So common information there about the license. So this is what the license holder would fill out: license number, expiry dates, name of the company they're contracted to, phone numbers, contact details, which local authority, exact location of description of the work, who the supervisor will be. So this is giving the HSE all of the information, as much of the information about the particular job that they're undertaken: start times, specifics, is there a waiver required, night working. As you can see, there's quite a lot of information they have to put through to the HSE: types of asbestos they're working on, general conditions, details of the type of work and general conditions. So this is like a snapshot of the plan of work that would be used for that particular work activity. Control measures, how the work will be supervised, so CCTV, vision panels, etc. And then of course there is a declaration. Now the declaration is very, very important. It states, I declare that an ACOP compliant plan of work has been prepared. So the process here is the contractor must assess the site, and they will have to visit the site to assess it. They will then develop their assessments and plan of work. From that, they will then complete the ASB 5, submit the ASB 5, and then wait for that time period to expire, and then they will obviously start works on site. It's very important they do that. There is, in my opinion, there is no way that a contractor can fill out an ASB 5 without putting the plan of work together. And it is a condition on their license. Do contractors often submit ASB 5s without putting plans of work together? Unfortunately, there are, and there have been occasions of this. And in occasions, the HSE could contact the removal contractor within couple of minutes of their submission and ask to see a copy of that plan of work. So of course it's imperative that they do put that plan of work together first, otherwise that is a breach of the license conditions. So we need to think about if we've got to select a license contractor. There's a standard license on the right hand side of the screen. In the first instance, we've got to determine that they actually have a license, and if you refer to condition 1, it says there anybody that is employing the contractor, this license should be made available. So make the checks, have a look and ask for a copy of their license. Unfortunately, it's not as clear just to look at their license. There is issue and expiry dates. You need to do a bit of due diligence on this. The licenses are scanned, they're emailed, they're copied. Licenses can be revoked, and of course the license would have to be submitted back to the HSE, but if the contractor has maintained a copy of this, we need to do just a bit of cross-referencing. What we really need to do is have a look at the HSE's website. So just for reference, if you Google HSE asbestos license contractors, on there will be a list of all the licensed contractors, and that is the most up-to-date list, which will have the license number, the contractor's name, and of course the expiry date. So of course you need to check that that all ties up with a copy of the license that you've actually been issued with. And there have been occasions where I've visited sites and I've asked who the contractor was, And the client has told me who the contractor was, and I've known the contractor, and I've stated, was you aware that they hadn't, they've lost their license? They had their license revoked, and they wasn't aware of it. So you do need to do your due diligence checks to make sure, obviously, they are suitably competent to do that work. The other thing to question is the prohibitions, improvement notices. Most clients will often have pre-qualification questions. This is one that often comes up. But you can do your checks on that. Slightly different web page, but hse.gov.uk notices, and on there you can type in the name of the contractor. You can even type in the regulation, and it can will obviously tell you if there's any prohibitions or improvements or prosecutions. Other qualifying documentation we might want to think about looking for: liability certificates, insurance, valid license, worker training records. There's 3 designations of or disciplines within the asbestos licensing sector. So you've operative supervisors and managers. They have different training courses, making sure obviously that they have the relevant certification, and of course that is in date. There is a 12-month expiry on their training. Just as a side, on the non-licensable training, because they're working with asbestos, there is also a 12-month on that one as well. Health and safety management training records, such as IOSH Managing Safely, other management health and safety training courses, SMSTS, SSSTS, things like that. Health and safety policies, company risk assessments, standard operating procedures, medical records, face fits for all RPE. I don't want to go into face fit in too much detail because there's quite a lot to it, but generally for licensed contractors, they will use reusable respirators. And of course, as such, they will have to have the quantitative face fit test. Certainly will have to have that for the full face. And they generally have 2 types, one half mask and one full face. And then any references from any previous work that they've undertaken. Word of mouth is probably one of the biggest adverts and that contractors can use. What can you expect prior to commencing the work? Well, they will have to come to have a look at the work. They can't assess that remotely. They'll have to look at the site setup to see where they're going to locate certain equipment, such as a decontamination unit. They may have to pre-clean if there's already debris in the site. Waste storage, such as skips, so if you can facilitate and allow them certain site storage for their equipment. They will obviously issue their notification pack, including the plan of work, to the client. One of the things to ask for is a copy of the ASB 5 that will tie up with the plan of work. Remember, the plan of work will be done before the ASB 5, and then of course maybe a copy of the receipt that the HSE submit back to the contractor to say they've received it. Agree the scope of the clearance, so how far is the clearance going to go, handover, and designation of transit route. So transit route is from the site enclosure to the decontamination unit. Other than that, they will have what's called direct connection. And any site-specific emergency procedures that your site requires. One in particular is fire emergencies. What you don't want the contractors to do is to, in the event of a fire, remove themselves from the enclosure and then take them to your muster point where all your staff are. They will be wearing their overalls, they will be wearing their respirators, so you really need to dedicate them an area away from everybody else so that they are isolated from cross-contamination. The plan of work that you'll be submitted, obviously, to clients in accordance with CAR. Regulation 6 is assessment. 7 is obviously the method statement or plan of work that needs to be prepared. It needs to be job and site specific. Must emphasize, it must be prepared before they do the notification, and that needs to be job and site specific. Now, again, on a lot of training courses, we go into plans of work quite a lot of detail, but this is obviously quite a short webinar. So things to look for: the nature and probable duration of the work, the number of people involved, the address, making sure obviously that ties up with where you want the works to be undertaken, the methods to be used, what they're going to do with the waste, etc., type of equipment, PPE, RPE, site setup, good clear drawings, location drawings, etc., showing obviously that works. There will also be within the plan of work details of the control measures they'll be using. So there's a number of control measures they can use, but it does depend on the product that they are working on. So wrap and cut would be for redundant plant, where they wrap it in polythene and then they cut the plant out and that gets disposed of as one. Spray wetting speaks for itself really. Spray wetting using a spray bottle with a solution of surfactant and water. Shadow vacuuming using special H-type vacuums, and wet injection systems are used for injecting pipe lagging, spray coatings, etc. Some of the images on the screen there, we can see top left, you've got wrap and cuts. That's using like a glove bag system. Bottom left, floor tile with spray wetting. There's a H-type vacuum in the middle there. There's obviously maintenance requirements for that. And of course, top right there, we've got the drill mate, which obviously is connected to the vacuum cleaner. And the bottom right is the standard injection system, which obviously will inject needles into products such as lagging and spray coating and saturate the product from inside. And the principles behind all of these control measures is to reduce the fibre release. If we reduce the fibre release, then of course we're reducing the risks to the workers undertaking this work activity. The work obviously to prevent the spread in a lot of cases for certainly spray coatings, insulation, AIB, and of course also Artex and texture coating now, they will obviously have to, in most cases, construct an enclosure. There are occasions where they don't need to, but they like to construct these enclosures to prevent the spread. And again, there's various different configurations of enclosures. So on the pictorial there, you can see there's a piece of plant, or a plant room, I should say. You can see the 3 stages of the airlock. The green arrows is the transit and waste route, so out the area to the other areas of the site. And you can see that that's the room there is obviously their enclosure, maintaining obviously the spread of any asbestos or loose fibres. 2 types of connection. The first one on screen is what's called direct connection. The principles of direct connection is, if we start on the left, the contractor will start in the clean end, derobe themselves, they'll pass through the hygiene unit, through the tunnel, putting ovals on, etc., and then of course carrying out the work activities. When they come back out, they go through preliminary decontamination and then their main decontamination in the hygiene unit. The waste comes through the 1 stage through to the tunnel and then out through the bag lock. They're not allowed to take the waste through the hygiene facility for obvious reasons. It's a hygiene facility. That is the preferred site setup where possible. One of the most common site setup is where we have what's called transiting. So this is where you'd have a route of entry for the personnel and a route of exit for the waste. So the 3-stage airlock would be where the personnel pass through, and then the waste obviously comes back out through. Now, obviously I haven't shown you on screen there should be a decontamination unit. Now the decontamination unit, if you was to imagine that was to the left-hand side of the 3-stage airlock, then that route would be classed as the transit route from the working enclosure to the decontamination unit. Now the decontamination unit for most would look like a small caravan, no windows but 2 doors, and the decontamination unit in most cases has 3 compartments. There are some new configurations coming on site now with welfare facilities, etc. But in principle, we have a clean end, we have a shower in the middle, and we have a dirty end. So of course there's a process they follow. There's a ratio of the shower heads per workers on site, and generally 1 shower head per 4 individuals. So if there's more than 4 people, they do need a twin shower unit. And of course these units, they are a hygiene facility, so they must be kept clean and of course maintained. There's also record keeping, inspection requirements, etc. For the decontamination unit. So it's like a small caravan that needs to be set up on site. You may need to provide water, water supply, and maybe some power, but some of them nowadays are self-contained units, and they'll run off generators to supply the electric, and bowsers or storage areas for the water for the shower. And then of course they'll manage all the wastewater that comes from that. So that's a very quick snapshot look at sort of the license, what to expect for license removal works. Now, let's assume the licensed contractor has done the job inside the enclosure. They've finished. How do we know they've done it properly? One of the requirements of the control of asbestos regulations is that they must engage a UKATA accredited analyst to undertake the certificate of reoccupation. This is done at the end of the job. This will be done by the analyst. I'll show you the certificate of reoccupation shortly, but they must be independent of the contractor. It's strongly recommended that the client appoints the analyst, so there is no conflict there. It's not a big industry, but of course the client should be managing the analyst and making sure that they've got their chosen analyst for that job, and then they can demonstrate the impartiality there. Contractors will gladly appoint the analysts. If you want them to appoint, you could nominate your analysts, and that the contractor liaise with the analyst. to make sure obviously that they are independent of the contractor undertaking the work. Now there's generally sort of 5 air tests that analysts can carry out. Background monitoring, this is often carried out before the work begins, sometimes referred to as the ambient. There are various different terms that contractors, analysts and consultants like ourselves will use, but it can be carried out before the work starts just to set a benchmark to see what the ambient levels are. Whilst the work is being undertaken, an analyst could be undertaking leak monitoring outside of the area. So this would be around the perimeter of the enclosure, the exit points, the exit of the negative pressure unit, to ensure there's no leakage of asbestos fibres to the outside. Personal monitoring is undertaken inside on the individuals undertaking the work, and that would be undertaken by the analyst and the contractor wearing a special personal pump around the lapel, and that will demonstrate the level of exposure that that analyst is subject to inside the working area. The clearance test, this is done after the removal works, but done inside the area to determine the level of exposure or level of fibre concentration inside the enclosure prior to them removing the enclosure. And then once obviously the removal works has been undertaken, the enclosure has been taken down, an analyst could obviously also undertake some reassurance monitoring after it's removed. As I've said, these are my definitions. There are analysts will use various other definitions, but I like to break them down into stages of the work activity so clients understand them a little bit better. A lot of analysts will use background monitoring is the same as reassurance monitoring. So this is just my sort of take on it. The 4-stage certificate of reoccupation is undertaken by the analysts. This is done obviously before the contractor can hand that area back. The first stage is they'll do a preliminary check of the site condition, make sure the site is set up, making sure everything is in place, the site is live, decontamination units are in place. Visually inspect the transit routes, waste routes, make sure there's no debris, contamination or waste. If they're happy with stage 1, that's signed off. That will then move to stage 2, a thorough visual inspection inside the working enclosure. So the analyst will go inside the area, they would do a thorough visual inspection, and that will take as long as it takes depending on the size of the area and the complexities of the job. If they're happy with the visual, the analysts will then put their pumps inside the area and do the air monitoring. Normally they would leave the pumps running for about an hour, but that does depend on the volume of air that they're pulling through. So it can be reduced somewhat, but it's all about the volume of air they pass through. And of course, if the analyst then counts those slides and they achieve the clearance indicator or the limit quantification, which is less than 0.01, then of course the analyst instructs the contractor, they can then take the enclosure down, but the analyst's work is not finished. The analyst will then carry out a thorough visual inspection of all areas where obviously there could have been cross-contamination. People often ask me, how long does a certificate of reoccupation take? In my opinion, I think you need to allow anywhere between 3 to 4 hours for an analyst to do a proper certificate of reoccupation. But there are some that will do it quicker, but what we try to achieve here is the analyst does a thorough job to ensure there is no fine dust, debris. And clients, yourselves, you are looking to ensure that the work has been done properly, and of course there is no cross-contamination or potential exposure. What does a certificate of reoccupation look like? They're changing. We are waiting for the new guidance, HSG 248, to be released. And one of the requirements is that there's going to be more information, more photographs clearly laid down. So the certificate of reoccupation I'm going to show you is generally following what the new guidance document will be asking for. There are some analysts will still hand write and hand draw, but there are a lot of systems out on site now where analysts will use tablets to carry out the certificate of reoccupation, and the certificate is then issued very, very quickly. So for example, I have redacted most of this. I can't share the site and of course who the analyst and who the contractor is, but brief description of the job details. There's a diary there which obviously shows the date, arrival, when the 4-stage process began, and of course this particular one, the enclosure deconstruction, was underway in the afternoon, so the 4th stage, because it was such a big job, had to be completed the following day. Stage 1, as we've said there, so all the areas, work area, surrounding areas, leak tests carried out, transit routes, waste routes, make sure they're all clean, and some good clear photographs which obviously show the areas. This is demonstrating the analyst did undertake stage 1 because there's photographs there. And you can see there the time there is 10:47. Stage two is the visual inspection. So after the stage one has been completed, the analyst will move to stage two. They'll take photographs inside. They'll make sure obviously there is no residual debris, no contamination, it's free from any dust. Please note the time, 13:25. So the analyst has obviously been doing that visual for 166 minutes if you look at the top right hand side, fourth row down. So it's quite a big job, and the analyst has to be in there for that time to make sure they're thoroughly the area is thoroughly clean and free from any dust, debris or contamination. Stage three, there was 4 tests done, so you can see the test there. What clients should be looking for is the concentration of fibers, ensuring that those columns there, this is a third column from the right, and ensuring that obviously those are less than 0.01. If they are any higher than that, then of course in most cases the contractor will be asked to go back in and clean, further clean. So that was done on that particular day. The following day, the analyst obviously went back to complete the 4th stage, and you can see there the analyst on stage 3 has taken photographs of the 4 pumps at the strategic locations within the enclosure. Stage 4, the following day at 11:30, you can see there, obviously highlights that there's no enclosure left, there's no airlocks, there's no polythene, the area's been totally cleaned and free of work equipment. That will then be signed off by the analyst, also signed by the supervisor, and that would then obviously highlight a drawing which would show all the areas and the position of the pumps for that air test. So this is the future. This is where the certificates should be going. This is where the certificates need to be, what they need to be looking like going forward. So just to conclude really on my part, the UKATA training available for clients who wish to know more about asbestos removal. There are 2 courses. The duty to manage appointed person, that does include some of what you've seen on the screen there, but in a bit more detail, but that is part of a duty holder course. On the left hand side, that is under development. I have this Chief Operating Officer Craig Evans with me here today, and we're currently finalising the course for that. That's just got to go to board, so that hopefully will be a day and a half in duration. So if a client, for example, has an asbestos awareness course, a UKATA awareness course, they can then do that in just a day, but that will give a lot more information about the asbestos removal contractor. As I said in my introduction, it's a sort of 3-hour about asbestos removal in 45 minutes, and at that point that is me done. So thank you very much for your time, everybody. If you have any questions, I think there's a few questions bouncing around there, Ben. I see them popping up on the screen. So I'll be happy to answer questions for the next, say, 15 minutes or so.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much, Graham, for another excellent presentation. We do, yeah, you're right, we do have quite a number of questions, so we're going to work through as many of these as we can. Just before we do, I'm going to quickly launch a poll, which is just to get some feedback from those listening in. It should come up on your screen now. If you could take a few minutes just to go through those and answer those questions for us, that's great, because we can obviously then use that for future reference for future webinars. So, in terms of questions then, the first question that's come through here we've got is when carrying out a site inspection, and that's not an asbestos removal site but just a general construction site, is there a minimum level of training for site personnel? Is it a legal requirement for all trade persons to have asbestos awareness training? And does the training have to be formal accredited training?
Yeah, anybody who is likely to come into contact with asbestos during their day-to-day activities. So, for example, if people are doing site inspections, as a minimum requirement under the regulations since 2006, they do require to have a basic asbestos awareness course. That will basically give them information as to what to look out for, and of course if they do spot or they're suspecting any asbestos, then they can report that back, and then that could possibly commission further inspections or surveys, etc. Regarding, there was a question there about accreditation. UKATA are not accrediting any of their training providers, but as the chair of UKATA, I would strongly advise that if you was to use a UKATA training provider, then of course you can be safe in the knowledge that the information provided on the training course will be to a very, very high standard.
Excellent. Okay, great. There's someone here who has said that they work in a local authority with an asbestos team, and they sit on the asbestos steering group. So the frustrations that come out of their meeting is finding a good asbestos removal company. What they tend to find is that the large ones aren't interested in small works, and the small ones often don't get through their procurement procedures. What are your experiences in finding a good contractor?
Unfortunately, there's good and bad in every industry, and I don't think this industry is any different to that. My experience is there are some big companies out there, and there are also some smaller companies. I do find the smaller companies, they've probably got a lot to lose, but do they have, as you've quite highlighted there, do they have the skills to meet your procurement? Word of mouth has got to be the best way forward, and share that information. Certainly if you are on committees and steering groups, I certainly know a lot of local authorities, they get together in certain areas in London and certain counties. Then of course sharing that information. Unfortunately, I can't give you any recommendations for any contractors. I know a lot of asbestos removal contractors, and there's good and bad in every industry.
Okay. Short one here. The health surveillance for licensable work with the 2-year medical and 40-year surveillance, is that the same for someone who has had an exposure of asbestos as well?
No, it's generally, if somebody's had an inadvertent exposure, the general process and procedure is that you record the incident. It may have to be notified under RIDDOR, but put that to one side. We need to record the information, record the levels of exposure. So if there has been an inadvertent exposure, we need to call an analyst out maybe to do some air monitoring, and then that needs to be notified to the individual so they've got their own record. What most employers would generally advise is that they take that letter to their GP so it's on their record. The employer would also keep a record of their in their personnel file. There is no benefit in going for x-rays and lung function tests. We're all well aware it can take up to 60 years to an asbestos disease to develop. So by going and having x-rays, etc., it's not going to highlight anything, but records certainly do need to be kept.
Okay, and could you clarify what should be done with sealed items, such as old electrical intakes that are presumed to have got asbestos in them? This person says that they've got some re-inspections triggered by a no access sign and would like to know if these can be ignored.
Okay. On the previous seminar I did, we did speak about no access. I don't like the term no access. I do find surveyors offering no access surveys, and that's down to maybe commercialism and laziness. If the surveyor had accessed those areas, then you would be knowing exactly what to do. If you are making a presumption and you are sealing them, then of course that is the control measure you need to put in place. Make sure that is sealed, and that is the control. If obviously they're going to be removed, then of course you'd have to err on the side of caution and remove them in accordance with the regulations and as a licensable product. But again, in my previous seminar, I don't like no access areas. I think it becomes lazy for surveyors to issue no access, no access. Your problem being is that once it's a no access, you then have to manage it on the basis that there is asbestos in there, and that does obviously become a time-consuming issue and a costly exercise for yourself. One of the things to do just going forward on this is, if you are commissioning surveys, make sure that you get the caveats and exclusions at the front end of a point in the surveyor. That will tell you what they're not going to do. You can then maybe provide the electrician or provide the lift engineer prior to the survey. Then you will eliminate those no access areas.
Excellent. Okay. And what would be an acceptable plan for monitoring the control limits that are maintained in short duration licensable works?
Right, okay, a bit confusing this question, because there's no such thing as short duration licensable works. Okay, licensable works are licensable works, but if we use an AIB as an example, I think that's probably where you're going with this one. So let's say, for example, if the AIB is short duration works, it's non-licensable works. How do we maintain, obviously, the control limit is not being exceeded? I'll refer you to HST 210. The title of the book is the Essentials Task Manual, and it says in the subtitle, for non-licensed works. This means the HSC have done the assessments on them work activities to prove that they don't exceed the control limit. However, again, it's always advisable that if you are unsure, you need to provide evidence just to make sure you have met that requirement. Test it, get an analyst to do some personal monitoring whilst the short duration works is being undertaken.
Okay, earlier on in the webinar, you mentioned there are no licensed managers or something in the country. I think it was something you related to. You weren't sure.
Supervisory license holders, yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. So this person just wanted if you could just confirm that and how you would train to get such qualification.
Right, supervisory license holders. There is training courses for supervisory license holders. If you have a look on the UKATA's website, there is basically you would need an asbestos manager's certificate. You would then have to apply to the HSE to obtain that license. That's going to cost you a fee of over £3,000. You'd have to demonstrate competency, experience in the industry, but more importantly, you will have to make sure that you can exercise that license and use it. It's not a commercialism. And many years ago, 15 years ago, there was several analytical companies, consultancies who had supervisory licenses. They've all given them up because no client is using them. And of course, if the HSE have highlighted that companies are not using the license in the manner at which it's being issued, it's not for a commercial gain, and they will revoke the license. So it's not a business opportunity there. The fact is that clients generally now, because of the cost of asbestos removal and then burdening £1,000 plus a day for a supervisory license holder, if you've got a good contractor, they will have supervisors as part of the project anyway. They should be more than competent to supervise their works.
Right, okay. We've got a few more minutes left, so we'll continue going through with these. So the next person has asked, when it comes to due diligence checks and medical records, what detail can we demand to see as a client without the contractor breaching GDPR?
Oh, GDPR. Oh, that's a headache that is in his first thing. The thing is, all you need to do is review. The contractor will be issued with a copy of the medical for the employee. The employee will also have a copy of their own medical. All you really need to do is to be able to see it. The contractor will stamp to say it's a verified copy. And you also got to bear in mind that these are licensed contractors and the HSE are also asking them the same questions. So I wouldn't concern yourself too much with it, but certainly to make sure it's a visual as that individual. That will be on site as well. So when you have the contractor on site, they will have copies of the medicals, they'll have copies of their training. All you are doing is looking at the medical. The medical does not give any indication as to the medical history of the individual. It just purely is a certificate with a name, an address, and of course the doctor that's undertaken the medical. So I wouldn't think it's going to contravene any GDPR, but I'm not a GDPR expert. I've had people in my office that deal with that.
Fair enough. Okay, this one should be a fairly quick one. The person just asked if you could repeat with regards to the CROO, whether it needs to be issued the next day always.
No. It was just that was a very, very large job. The certificate of reoccupation can be issued in 1 half day visit by the analyst. So, for example, if the contractor was finishing this afternoon and they would finish at, say, 12 o'clock, the analyst would arrive at 12 o'clock. They would carry out the certificate of reoccupation. If it was a reasonably smallish area or medium-sized area, the analyst should be able to complete that on the same day and then issue certification on the same day. It's just that one I showed you as an example. The visual inspection, for example, 166 minutes, that's just shy of 3 hours just to do the actual visual. So then, of course, the enclosure has to be struck. Now, that could take another 3 or 4, 5 hours. So sometimes they do have to roll over, but in a lot of smaller jobs now, it can be issued on the same day.
Okay, great. And with regards to the ASB5, can that be completed online, like the F10 notification?
Yeah, they're all online now. Yeah, they're all completed online. The contractor will complete online. They'll get a receipt for that. And again, that's something you also need to ask for a copy of that to ensure, obviously, that they have put that notification in, because again, it's a legal requirement on their part.
Okay, this person's asked, if you have waste stored externally, which has been removed due to groundworks, which contained a small amount of degraded asbestos, say, let's say less than 1%, would there be a requirement for air tests during the removal if it's identified as cryostyle and crocodilite?
Crocodilite, yeah, no, that's fine. So you've basically got some spoil which has got contamination in it. You haven't mentioned sort of volumes there, so I'm going to make an assumption that you're going to use maybe a machine to pick it up and maybe place into a container ready for disposal. It's strongly advised that you would probably have some reassurance air monitoring around the perimeter of the site to ensure obviously there is no spread. It shouldn't be too much of a problem, but the other thing to bear in mind, if there is contamination in there, you might want to think about additional control measures such as atomizers, dust suppression techniques to keep those levels down. One of the things you've got to prove here is that whilst you're doing that work, you're not spreading asbestos. So the air monitoring around the perimeter is certainly very useful.
Okay, we'll just have one final one, and this is just, if you remove a ceiling tile to gain access to something above, does that come under non-licensed work due to it being ancillary work?
It certainly can do. We don't know what the ceiling tile is. So, for example, if the ceiling tile was AIB, let's work on the worst case. Can the work be done within a short duration of less than 1 hour for a person? In most cases, it possibly can be. Then that would be classed as non-licensed works. And of course, if they're doing it for inspection purposes, yes, it would be classed as ancillary. Sorry, not ancillary, as short duration maintenance works. Remember, ancillary is for the license holders, so they would be ancillary license holders. But for short duration works, as long as it is maintenance works, it's incidental to the main task being undertaken, then it would become non-licensable.
Fantastic. Okay, well, we are kind of at the end of the session. There are quite a number of questions that we've not managed to get through to, unfortunately, but what we will do is we'll put these questions to Graham separately, and if he's got the time, he'll be able to put some answers together in writing, which I will then be able to obviously email out to all of you at a later date. So sorry if your question hasn't been answered. As I mentioned earlier, the session has been recorded, so it can be played back, and we will also send out a PDF copy of the presentation for you to be able to review. For those of you who haven't seen part 1 of this, that is also available as well. That's also online, and again, I will email details of that to you along with the details of this particular webinar. So I hope you all found it enjoyable. I hope you all found it informative. Graham, thank you very much again for coming in to deliver that. I think it was a really, really informative webinar, and from a lot of the feedback that you've all put back in, it seems to be very, very popular. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Excellent. Okay, thank you all for attending. Hope to see you at the next one. The session will end in the next sort of 30 seconds or so if you want to just get any final last minute comments or questions over to us before we close the session. Thank you very much.